everyone, and welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be looking at something pretty cool, I think, the connection between language and peace. We've got some really interesting academic research to dig into. It's looking at online news from 18 different countries. So are you ready to jump in?
Yeah, definitely. It sounds fascinating.
All right, so imagine this. Just by analyzing the words that are used in a country's news, researchers are trying to figure out how peaceful that country actually is. What kind of words do you think would pop up when you think about like a peaceful place versus a place that's maybe a bit more like, I don't know, volatile, I guess?
That's a really interesting question. I guess I would think words like harmony or like cooperation would show up in the news for peaceful countries. And then maybe words like conflict or maybe even military for the ones that are experiencing like unrest or something.
You're spot on. The researchers actually started with an approach kind of like that, using human intuition and existing peace research to come up with these word lists. But here's where things get pretty interesting. They also used a machine learning system to analyze that same news data, and they let the AI find its own patterns.
Oh, wow. So they combined those two approaches. How cool. What did they find when they compared the human list to what the AI came up with?
Well, get this. The AI went in like a totally different direction.
Really?
Yeah, take a look at these word clouds. We'll put these up on the website too, but they really show the contrast between the two.
Whoa, you weren't kidding. Okay.
Yeah.
So in the low peace countries, the AI is focusing on words like government, politics, control.
Yeah.
It seems like there's a lot of emphasis on these formal structures. But then in the high peace countries, it's all about daily life. Homework, games, even the word diversity pops up.
Yeah, it's almost like the news in those countries that are less peaceful is always looking upward, focused on who's in charge and what rules are being put in place. While in the more peaceful places, the conversation is more grounded in those like everyday interactions and the things that connect people. What do you think about that difference?
It definitely seems like there are different societal mindsets going on there. Remember, the AI isn't understanding these words the way that we do. It's noticing the patterns and how the words are being used and how those patterns relate to these peace indices.
So it's not about the words themselves, but more about what their usage tells us about the dynamics of that society.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A focus on control and government actions might show a lack of trust, or maybe a feeling that things are being imposed rather than like achieved through cooperation.
Yeah.
On the other hand, when we see those everyday words, it suggests a focus on shared experiences and more of sense of community.
It really changes how we think about peace, doesn't it? Because now it's not just the absence of war or violence. It's like something deeper about how a society actually functions day to day.
Yeah, and this research goes even beyond looking at individual words. They also use some cool techniques like topic clustering and sentence analysis to get a more well-rounded picture of what's being talked about in the news.
So they're zooming out a bit to see the bigger picture, not just focusing on individual words, but how those words fit together in these larger conversations. What did they find when they looked at things from that perspective?
One of the most interesting findings was that low-peace countries, they had much less diversity in the topics that were covered in their news, which also kind of mirrors that lack of diversity we saw in their word choices too.
That makes sense if they're so focused on like government and control. It's like everything else kind of gets pushed to the side. But what does that limited diversity in the topics actually mean? Does it affect how people think and how they interact with each other?
Yeah, that's a big question that the researchers are looking into. If there's not a lot of room for open dialogue and hearing a variety of perspectives, then it might actually hold back a society's ability to really address difficult problems and come up with solutions that work for everyone.
Yeah.
Think about it. How can you come up with creative ideas or solve these challenging problems if everyone is kind of stuck in the same narrow way of thinking?
It's like trying to build a house, but you only have one type of brick. You might be able to get a structure, but it's not going to be very interesting or adaptable.
That's a great analogy. And this is where the research gets even more interesting. They're trying to move beyond just identifying these patterns in language and actually use those patterns to understand those underlying social processes that contribute to peace.
So they're using language as a way to understand how societies work and what makes them tick. Tell me more about how they're doing that.
Well, they're using AI and a technique where they feed the system lots of information about different social processes, like how groups interact with each other, whether it's in a positive cooperative way or a more negative competitive way.
So they're basically teaching the AI to recognize those complex social dynamics in the news articles.
Exactly. And they've actually found some surprising insights, even in a country like the United States.
Oh, really? That's interesting. What did they find out about the U.S.?
Well, the U.S. generally scores pretty high on these traditional peace indices. But when they looked at how different groups interact within the country, the AI showed a lower level of what they call positive intergroup reciprocity.
Positive intergroup. What? No, sorry. Can you break that down a little bit for me?
Of course. So it basically means that different groups within the US aren't engaging with each other in a positive, cooperative way as often as you might expect in a nation that's considered highly peaceful.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's more tension and less collaborative problem solving happening between the different groups.
That's surprising considering our overall ranking on those peace indices. What do you think that difference tells us?
It might suggest that even in a country that's seen as relatively peaceful, there's still a lot of room for improvement when it comes to building positive relationships and interactions between different communities.
Like, we might be peaceful on a national level, but there are still these pockets of tension and distrust kind of simmering under the surface.
Exactly. And this research shows how important it is to look past those broad measures of peace and understand those more subtle dynamics that are happening within a society.
It seems like these linguistic fingerprints can tell us a lot about what's really going on, both the good and the bad.
Absolutely. And that brings up a really important question. If we can use language to measure peace, can we also use it to actually build a more peaceful world?
Whoa, that's a big question. It's like we're not just passively observing language anymore, but we can actually use it as a tool to shape our reality.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to explore in the next part of our deep dive.
This is getting really interesting. I can't wait to dig into that more.
What's really fascinating here is this idea that language doesn't just reflect how peaceful a place is, it can actually influence it.
So you're saying it's not just a mirror, but like a tool we can use to build a more peaceful world.
Exactly. If a country's news is always talking about conflict and division, it can make those things even stronger in society. Like, just think about it. If all you're hearing about is what separates people, it makes it harder to see what brings them together, right?
Yeah, it's like that saying, what you focus on expands. So if we're always seeing messages about conflict, no wonder it feels like it's everywhere.
Exactly. What if we could change that story, though? Like, what if we focused more on things like shared goals and cooperation and understanding? Instead of pointing out what divides us, what if we talked more about the things we have in common?
It's like we're changing our perspective, looking for connections instead of just differences.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just about specific words, but how we use them, too.
Yeah.
For example, instead of jumping right to blame and accusations, what if we try to use language that shows empathy and understanding? Even when we disagree, can we talk about it in a way that's more constructive?
So it's not about ignoring problems or pretending everything's okay. It's about tackling them in a way that could lead to something good. Is that what you mean?
That's exactly it. Now, I'm not saying that just changing our words will fix every problem in the world.
Yeah, it's not a magic solution. But if language can shape the way we see things and affect our actions, it seems like it could at least help create a more peaceful environment.
Precisely. Think of it this way. Words are like seeds. If we're always planting these seeds of conflict, it's not surprising that the world feels full of division. But if we can start planting seeds of peace even in small ways, who knows what could grow from them?
I love that analogy. It gives me hope, but it also makes me realize that we all have a part to play, right?
Absolutely. We all have a role in creating the world we want to live in. And that starts with being more aware of the words we use and how they impact us and other people.
So where do we even begin? How can we be more conscious of our language choices, especially when it comes to peace?
It starts with being aware. Just start noticing the words you use and think about their impact. Do they create a feeling of connection and understanding? Or do they just reinforce division and conflict?
It's like taking a moment before we speak and asking, is this helping or hurting?
Exactly. And this isn't just about big speeches or pronouncements. It's the everyday chats we have with our families, our friends, coworkers, even people we don't know. Every conversation is a chance to either add to the conflict or to plant a seed of peace.
That's powerful. It makes me think about all those times we get caught up in arguments or disagreements, and how easy it is to make things worse with the words we choose.
And on the other hand, think about how a kind word or a gesture of understanding can calm things down and lead to a better outcome. It's not about being perfect or always saying the right thing. It's about choosing our words carefully and using them to do something good.
So we need to shift our thinking from seeing language as just a way to express ourselves to seeing it as a way to influence the world around us.
What are some practical ways we can actually do this? I'm sure our listeners would love some real world tips.
Absolutely. One of the best things we can do is practice active listening. Even when we disagree with someone, instead of interrupting or jumping in with a counter argument, can Can we really try to see things from their point of view?
So it's about being open to dialogue and understanding, even when it's hard.
Exactly. Another thing is to be mindful of how we talk about other people, especially those who are different from us. Can we try to avoid stereotypes and generalizations and see each person as an individual?
That's a tough one, especially these days when it's so easy to get caught up in labels and categories. But it feels important if we want a society that's more peaceful and welcoming to everyone. Absolutely. And finally, can we try to use language that's more positive and focused on solutions? Instead of dwelling on problems, can we focus on finding ways to work together to build a better future?
So, shifting our focus from what divides us to what unites us, and using our words to build bridges instead of walls.
Exactly. Now, I know all of this might sound really idealistic, but I really believe language can change the world, one conversation at a time.
It reminds us that we're not just passive with language. We can actually shape its meaning and impact. It's exciting and kind of scary at the same time, don't you think?
It is. But even small changes in the words we choose can have an effect. Imagine if everyone committed to using their words to spread a little more kindness, understanding, and hope. What kind of world could we create?
That's a beautiful thought, and one I think we should all aim for. Before we get too far ahead, though, let's go back to that research for a minute. We were talking about how the AI could analyze social dynamics in the news. Did they find any other interesting things?
They did. And this one connects really well to what we're talking about. The way a society talks about certain topics can actually help predict how peaceful it will be in the future.
You mean they can forecast peace levels just from language patterns? That's amazing. How does that even work?
It's based on the idea that the way we talk about things reflects our values and beliefs, and those things ultimately shape what we do. So if a society is always using language that's full of fear and distrust and negativity towards other groups, it's more likely to see conflict later on.
So those negative words are like setting the stage for unrest.
Exactly. But it works the other way too. If a society's language is focused on things like cooperation, understanding, and finding common ground, it's more likely to create a future that's peaceful and harmonious.
So our words really do matter. They shape our reality both individually and as a whole. It's like we're writing the script for the future with every conversation.
That's a great way to put it. And it highlights how important it is to be aware of the stories we tell ourselves and each other. Are we telling stories that create fear and division? Or are we telling stories that inspire hope and connection?
That's a question we should all ask ourselves. It's a big responsibility, but it's also empowering to realize we have that much influence.
It is. And that leads us to our final segment where we'll talk about some more practical ways to use these ideas in our daily lives.
I can't wait. I think we could all use a little more peace in our lives, and if it starts with something as simple as choosing our words more carefully, I'm all in.
Okay, so we've been talking about how language can not only just show us how peaceful a place is, but it can actually shape it. And we even talked about how AI can predict future peace levels just based on how societies talk about things. But it's all kind of theoretical, right? Can we bring it down to earth a little? What does this look like in our everyday lives? That's a great question. It's easy to get caught up in the big picture, and forget that real change starts with each of us. Think about your interactions today. Did you notice any patterns in how you talked that might have added to either conflict or peace?
That's a good one. To be honest, now that you mention it, I can think of a couple of times where I probably could have been more careful with what I said, especially in that email thread with my coworker. Things got kind of heated there.
Oh yeah, we've all been there. But it's those everyday moments that really matter. Instead of immediately defending ourselves or trying to prove someone wrong, would we maybe reframe how we're talking about it? Maybe ask some questions to understand their perspective better.
It's almost like we need to train ourselves to see those moments as opportunities to actually practice being peaceful instead of just reacting without thinking.
Exactly. It's all about creating that little pause before we speak and asking ourselves, what kind of seed am I planting with these words?
I love that. It's such a simple image, but so powerful. It makes you realize that every single interaction, even the little ones, has this potential to ripple out and create some kind of change.
Absolutely. And it's not just about avoiding conflict. It's about actively using what we say to promote understanding, empathy, and connection. Think about the stories you share, the compliments you give, even how you listen and respond to other people.
It's like we're each carrying around this toolbox of language, and we can choose which tools we use to build the world we want to live in.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
It's about being intentional with our words, recognizing that they're not just neutral, they carry weight, they have power.
So as we're wrapping up this deep dive, I'm curious, what's one piece of advice you'd give our listeners about using language to promote peace?
My advice would be to really cultivate that sense of curiosity. Be curious about the people you're talking to, curious about different points of view, and even curious about how you use language yourself.
That's interesting. So instead of going into conversations trying to be right or win an argument, we should try to really learn and understand.
Exactly. When we're curious, we're more open to listening, to actually considering other perspectives and finding things we agree on. And that's where peace starts, with that willingness to connect even when it's tough.
What a great thing to remember. So, for everyone listening, I hope this deep dive has sparked some curiosity in you. Curiosity about the power of your words and how you can create a more peaceful world.
And remember, peace isn't some far off dream, it's something we can practice every single day in every interaction. So go out there and plant those seeds of peace, one word at a time.
That's a beautiful thought to end on. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the language of peace. We'll catch you next time for another deep dive.